Chapter 2. 2 Decades of Crisis. The system built by Kim Il-sung in North Korea was fatally flawed. It was unsustainable economically. It could function only as long as Moscow and Beijing were willing to provide Pyongyang with systematic aid. Kim Il-sung's Stalinism with national characteristics consequently did not outlive the abrupt end of the Cold War, which plunged North Korea into acute crisis. Many observers initially expected that North Korea would share the fate of other communist regimes and either collapse, like the communist countries of Eastern Europe, or initiate market-oriented reform, like Vietnam and China. These expectations did not materialize. North Korea neither collapsed nor reformed itself, but a lack of government-initiated reform did not mean that North Korea remained unchanged. Post-1994, North Korea is very different from the country established and run by Kim Il-sung. It might be run by the same people, or their children and nephews, and the state might sound the same, but its society is very, very different. And then the world changed. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He immediately embarked on a program of radical social, economic, and political reforms that triggered the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Around that time, China's leaders learned how communist sloganeering can be seamlessly combined with a rather Dickensian, but very efficient, version of capitalism. In turn, by the late 1980s, relations between the USSR and the PRC, which had become characterized by rivalry and discord since the 1950s, became cooperative. The rivalry between the USSR and the United States also lost its sharpness. In the early 1990s, both the Soviet elite and the Soviet public saw the United States not as an enemy to contain and undermine, but rather as a shining example to be admired and emulated. Such a rosy view did not survive for long in Moscow, but this is irrelevant to our story. Considerations that conditioned Soviet and Chinese policy toward North Korea for decades suddenly disappeared. Moscow and Beijing policymakers saw no more need to maintain North Korea as a buffer zone against the United States or to buy its neutrality with the Sino-Soviet schism. Concurrently, the economic transformation of the USSR meant that newly independent Russian enterprises, formerly state operations, were no longer willing to ship their wares to North Korea for nothing. Russian businesses would be, and still are, quite happy to sell spare parts for MiG fighters or crude oil, but they expected to be paid for their shipments in hard currency. North Korea has no hard currency. Sponsoring Pyongyang, therefore, became both politically unnecessary and economically unsustainable. Within the first perestroika years, bilateral trade between North Korea and the Soviet Union decreased roughly tenfold, from $2.56 billion in 1990 to a mere $0.14 billion in 1994. Incidentally, it has remained at roughly this level ever since, $0.11 billion in 2011. Further proof that without state subsidies or political pressure, Russian companies are not terribly interested in doing business with North Korea. See Note 1. Since North Korea's trade with communist countries was essentially aid in disguise, the dramatic drop in trade meant a comparable decline in the availability of free or subsidized products. The start of the new era in the North is usually linked to Kim Il-sung's death in July 1994. However, the social transformation of the 1990s had almost nothing to do with this political change at the top. Some of the measures undertaken by Kim Il-sung in the last years of his long rule were strikingly similar to what would become the norm under his son. Nonetheless, for the sake of convenience, we will describe this new era in North Korean history as the era of Kim Jong-il. The sudden disruption of foreign aid led to the collapse of the state economy. Being deprived of free spare parts and subsidized oil, many industries stopped functioning. Since all vital economic statistics in North Korea are a state secret, the exact scale of this economic collapse is disputable. Nonetheless, it seems that by the year 2000, industrial output in the state economy was approximately half of what it was in 1990. Officially, most factories were not closed, and employees were still required to attend their place of work daily. Most workers remained idle at work, however, with nothing to do. From the early 1990s, when official corruption started to grow exponentially, the most savvy and entrepreneurial among the managers of state enterprises began to make money by selling their non-operating equipment to China as scrap metal. In more extreme cases, old factories, often built in the colonial times, became empty shells, devoid of any equipment. In many regards, North Korean infrastructure has not changed much from the late colonial times. With the exception of a few highways, off limits to local traffic, paved roads are very rare outside major cities, and the railways continue to make occasional use of steam locomotives of 1930s vintage. However, in the mid-1990s, infrastructure suffered much more than it had up until that point. Frequent electricity outages meant trains that mainly relied on electric locomotives could be delayed by days, a remarkable circumstance for a country as large as Pennsylvania. But the worst blow was felt by the agricultural sector. Nearly all the Soviet-style agricultural systems, that of North Korea, was inherently and hopelessly inefficient. Modern farmers usually work well if they toil upon their own land and have some control over the harvest. This was not the case in North Korea, where the state owned the land and directly managed it in ways that even Joseph Stalin himself would see as excessive. Structural inefficiencies were exacerbated by a multitude of technical and political errors. To start with, North Korean agriculture had become heavily reliant on the use of chemical fertilizer. Initially, this policy decision made some sense because North Korea inherited highly developed fertilizer production facilities from the colonial period. But while this was the case, production itself was dependent on the supply of Soviet aid and was highly energy intensive. Another mistake was the heavy reliance on artificial irrigation that was made possible by the existence of large pumping stations. In some cases, water had to be first pumped up a few hundred meters above the level of its natural source, and only then directed towards the rice paddy fields. This worked well as long as electricity was in plentiful, cheap supply. The decline of electricity production, however, made this system unsustainable. Last but not least, the ill-conceived idea of terraced fields contributed to the natural disasters of the years 1995 through 96. This idea was once loudly lauded as a great invention of Kim Il-sung's personal genius. Terraced fields might be perfectly suitable for the farming conditions of southern China, but not in North Korea. As North Korean agricultural managers learned in due time and to their peril, terracing increased soil erosion and made areas under cultivation more vulnerable to torrential rains. Such rains hit North Korea in the summer of 1995, and then again in 1996. Official propaganda always blames subsequent events on these rains, which are described as a once-a-century natural calamity. The rainfall was indeed heavier than usual, but it is worth noting that the same rains produced almost no impact on the agriculture of South Korea, where there was an only notable result of the alleged unprecedented natural calamity, was a marginal increase in the price of cabbage and onions. For the North, the floods of 95 and 6 were the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. In order to feed its population, North Korea needs 5 to 5.5 million metric tons of grain. The exact figure is subject to some debate between experts. Until the early 1990s, the North Korean farmers managed to produce that much. Then the situation began to deteriorate. Deprived of fuel, electricity, and fertilizer, and manned by workers who had little incentive to care about the future harvest, the system collapsed. The 1996 harvest was a mere 2.5 to 2.8 million metric tons, half of what would have been enough to keep the population fed. For the average North Korean, this collapse of agriculture meant a sudden termination of the public distribution system, or PDS, which had been the major or even the only source of food for North Koreans since 1957. From 93 to 94, rations were increasingly delayed and or delivered only partially. The delays began in more remote areas of the countryside, but soon spread to major cities. After the floods, the PDS rations almost completely stopped. Even the privileged population of Pyongyang was issued partial rations, and there were periods, for example in 1998, when distribution completely failed. Outside of Pyongyang, only party cadres, police personnel, military officials, and the workers at military factories continued to receive their rations, and even those privileged groups did not necessarily receive full allowances in the years between 96 and 2000. For the average North Korean, this was a disaster. A twice-monthly trip to the grain distribution center was as normal as a weekend drive to a supermarket for an American family. Famine would ensue and soon took on disastrous dimensions. The number of people who perished in the Great North Korean Famine of 1996 through 99 will probably never be known with absolute certainty. Some non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, put the number as high as 3 million, while the North Korean government is in confidential communications with certain foreign guests, put the figure as low as 250,000. The first estimate is clearly a serious exaggeration, whilst the second is a face-saving underestimate. At the time of writing, there have been two serious attempts to estimate the scale of this disaster impartially. In 2001, Daniel Goodkind of Lorraine West concluded that excessive deaths most likely numbered between 600,000 and 1 million from the period from 1995 to 2000. See Note 2. In 2010, analyzing officially published results of the most recent 2008 North Korean population census, Park Kyung-suk estimated that the excessive deaths reached 880,000 in the 1993 to 2008 period, with the loss of about 490,000 being attributable to mortality increase, about 290,000 to fertility decline, and about 100,000 to outbound migration and its effects on fertility. See Note 3. In 2011, Goodkind and West, together with Peter Johnson, revised their early estimates of excess deaths downward to 490,000. See Note 4. Even if we accept the lowest estimate of 450 to 500,000, it still means that some 2.5% of the entire population perished in the disaster. This is roughly equal to the ratio of Chinese farmers who perished from starvation during the Great Leap Forward of the early 1960s. In other words, it was the largest humanitarian disaster East Asia had seen for decades. Nevertheless, the majority of North Koreans survived the famine. They did so by creating new ways of life, socially and economically. In essence, the North Korean people rediscovered capitalism, while the North Korean state had little choice but to relax its iron grip over the populace. The sorry fate of Katya Sinstova. Have you ever heard of Katya Sinstova, the beautiful Russian girl whose naive admiration for capitalism and its debased democracy brought ruin to her and her entire family? A girl whose sorry and lamentable fate is so reminiscent of the tragic fate of her country, which deviated from the true path of socialism? Katya Sintsova is a fictional and highly improbable character who appears in a North Korean short story, The Fifth Photo. This short story was produced by a North Korean writer named Rim Hwa-won, and is quite representative of the current North Korean writings about the collapse of the Soviet and Eastern European communism. As Tatiana Gabrosensko remarked in her soon-to-be-published study of this particular kind of North Korean fiction, in the 1940s and 50s, the Russians were portrayed in North Korean literature as leaders and guides helping their Korean comrades. In the 2000s, however, it is the Koreans who are the shining example, the embodiment of socialist virtues, who are looked upon as advisors and leaders. Russians are nowadays conversely presented as weak and naive, but still basically decent. Noble human beings who flourish under the wise guidance of their North Korean friends. For instance, in one of these stories, the CIA plants a bomb on a U.S. passenger airliner. The reason for this operation, and as every North Korean knows, this is the type of operation the CIA does frequently, is to kill a Russian scientist who refused to cooperate with the U.S. military-industrial complex. In the story, the Russian and his fellow passengers were lucky to have a North Korean on the same plane. The North Korean takes control of the situation and saves his fellow travelers from another vicious American plot. Of these stories, Rim Hwa-won's The Fifth Photo is quite typical. Katya Sintsova is the main character, is a beautiful Russian girl who comes from a family with impeccable communist credentials. Her great-grandfather died a heroic death in 1919 during the Russian Civil War. Her grandfather sacrificed his life fighting the Nazis, and her father was a selfless and hard-working party bureaucrat of the Brezhnev era. Her brother also became a top bureaucrat in the Moscow Party Youth Committee and was also equally selfless and hardworking. Katya was accepted to a top university due to her exceptional gifts in the arts, but at the university she fell under the spell of the wrong ideas. She began to interact with people whose ideological bent was less than healthy, and she even interacted with foreigners. The latter behavior is seen by Rim Hua-won as especially outrageous. She is upset about the contents of party meetings being so boring, and she is overcome by materialism and a lust for change. An American seduces and impregnates her, after which she has an abortion. Meanwhile, her father dies, his last words being, "Long live the Communist Party." Katya loves him and feels sorry about his death, but still considers him an old fool. This is when she meets the book's North Korean narrator, to whom she tries to sell photos from her precious family archive. The narrator is an example of flawless revolutionary virtue, and his own daughter is free from all the frivolous but dangerous ideas that have ruined Katya's life. The exemplary North Korean girl dreams only of serving the party and the leader better. The narrator's sons are brave officers of the Korean People's Army, always ready to fight the U.S. imperialists. They are even treated to the highest honor imaginable, being granted an audience with the dear leader, Marshal Kim Jong-il. Katya, meanwhile, travels overseas in search of her American lover. An awful discovery awaits her. He was not really an American, but the descendant of an anti-communist Russian landlord family. Almost a century before their lands were nationalized, the vicious landlord's family has spent all their time dreaming of revenge. Katya's seduction was actually part of a plot aimed at taking the lands back from the farmers and giving it to greedy and cruel landlords. Katya Sintsova's sufferings did not end with this awful discovery. While alone and helpless in the brutal West, she suffers a car accident and loses a leg. In order to survive, she becomes a prostitute serving perverts in the city of Munich. The message of this story is simple and easy to understand. Katya is Russia herself. She was lured into a trap by the Western propaganda and scheming descendants of landlords. She was fooled into selling her great heritage, and she ended up a pitiful prostitute at the bottom of the merciless capitalist heap. The story is written to serve as a clear warning to North Koreans who should not listen to the seductive voices from abroad and should remain on guard against their enemy. Capitalism reborn. In post-famine North Korea, the old state-run and state-owned economy was replaced by a great multitude of private economic activities usually associated with what is described as a black market. Somewhat misleadingly, as we shall see below. It was recently estimated that between 1998 and 2008, the share of income from informal economic activities reached 78% of the total income of North Korean households. See Note 5. However, as said above, North Korea's social transformation is rather different from near contemporaneous developments in China, and the former Soviet Union in that it was neither initiated nor endorsed by the authorities. For political reasons to be discussed later, Kim Il-sung's socio-economic system still remains an ideal for the North Korean elite. Nonetheless, this commitment does not go beyond words most of the time. The elite lack the resources and resolve that would make a revival of Kim Il-sung's National Stalinism possible. When rations suddenly stopped coming, people began to learn ways to cope with the new situation, the only alternative being death by starvation. For farmers, the most natural reaction was to start growing their own food. This was not that easy because, unlike their Chinese counterparts, North Korean bureaucrats showed no inclination to disband the notoriously inefficient state farms. The state farms' fields were therefore usually guarded, preventing farmers from using the best arable land for their production. A majority of farmers had to look for alternative places to farm for themselves. North Korea is a mountainous country, and thus it is not too difficult to find a steep slope that is not used for regular agriculture. A quick look at satellite pictures shows the presence of numerous small fields of irregular shapes and sizes located in the mountains. These are sotoji, literally small fields. The private plots of North Korea's farmers and inhabitants of smaller towns. Generally, the further away one lives from major administrative and political centers, the easier it is to develop such a field. In more remote parts of the country, sotoji now produce more than half of the harvest, but nationwide averages seem to be close to 20%. While farmers were working on their illicit plots, the urban population reacted to the new situation by discovering private commerce. Most urban families began by bartering household items for food. But soon, switched to trade and household production. Beginning in 1995, huge markets began to grow in North Korea's cities. They became the focal point of economic life in the country. Millions of North Koreans, women in particular, began to earn families' income through trade and household handicraft production. Women make up the majority of North Korea's market operation. Market vendors in North Korea are by no means the kind of street toughs one might encounter in black markets of other countries. Instead, they are largely housewives and mothers who make and sell to keep their family alive. This is partly due to North Korean society itself. For decades, the North Korean state required every able-bodied male to be employed by a state enterprise. Married women of working age, however, were allowed to stay at home as full-time housewives. When Kim Il-sung's system began to fall apart in the early 1990s, men continued to go to work. People expected that sooner or later things would return to what they thought of as normal, that is, to the old Stalinist system. They knew from their experience that people who have had at one time shown disloyalty to the state, for instance those who collaborated with South Korean authorities during the Korean War, were assigned a bad songbun. Thus, not only those people, but also their children and grandchildren faced many official restrictions. Men believed that it would be wise to keep to their official jobs for the sake of family's future. On top of these class anxieties, men also faced massive pressure from the state's lower officials. An absentee worker ran real chances of being sent to a prison for a few months of labor re-education. The situation for women was markedly different. They had spare time, and their involvement with private trade was seen as politically less dangerous, precisely because of the particular nature of a society where only men really mattered. In some cases, women began by selling household items they could do without. Eventually, these activities developed into larger businesses, and today some 3/4 of North Korean market vendors are women. As one would expect, soon thereafter, in the late 1990s, more successful businessmen, or rather businesswomen, moved from retail trade to wholesale trade. In many cases, they were the members of once discriminated against groups who benefited most from the new situation. For example, until the 1990s, it was a major handicap for any career-minded North Korean to have relatives overseas. In the 1990s, the opposite suddenly became the case. Relatives overseas, especially in China, could often provide small amounts of capital, quite large by then North Korean standards, give sound business advice, or even create a formal or informal joint venture. A typical story is of my own acquaintance, a young schoolteacher who, in the early 1990s, was asked by visiting Chinese relatives to buy them a large quantity of dried fish. She discovered that in merely a few days she earned well enough over her official annual salary, and decided to become a professional trader. Being a woman, she could leave her job without repercussions. By the early 2000s, some wholesalers had large sums at their disposal. They sometimes invested in new types of enterprise: eateries, storage facilities, semi-legal transportation companies. Indeed, the growth of the market that was initially centered around small-scale retail activities soon produced many kinds of associated private ventures. The restaurant industry is illustrative in this regard. Between 1996 and 1997, the state-run restaurant industry collapsed everywhere except for a few major cities. Private capital, however, almost immediately revived it, and most North Korean restaurants are now run by private entrepreneurs. Officially, they're not supposed to exist, and such eateries are technically state-owned. According to official papers, an eatery is owned by the state and managed by the relevant department of the municipal government. However, this is a legal fiction. A private investor makes an informal deal with municipal officers promising them a kickback, and he or she then hires workers and buys equipment. It is assumed that with a certain amount of the earnings will be transferred to the state budget. In return, the private owner runs a business at his or her discretion, investing or pocketing the profits. A 2009 study came to the conclusion that some 58.5% of all restaurants in North Korea are de facto privately owned. See Note 6. Similar trends exist in the retail industry. While the fiction of state ownership is maintained, many shops are essentially private. The manager owner buys merchandise from wholesalers as well as, technically, state-owned suppliers, and then sells it at a profit. The earnings are partially transferred to the state, but largely pocketed by the owner himself, or rather herself. The above-mentioned study estimated that in 2009, some 51.3% of shops were actually private retail operations. See Note 7. Transportation underwent similar changes. A large number of trucks and buses that traverse the dangerous, dirty roads of North Korea are owned privately. Private investors discovered that grossly inadequate transportation facilities were a major bottleneck to the emerging North Korean merchant class had to deal with. Investors began to buy used trucks and buses in China and bring these vehicles to North Korea. In the North, the vehicle would be registered as property of a government company or agency. The actual owner would pay the manager of this agency an agreed amount of money, usually on a monthly basis. Interestingly, the amount of money is contingent on the agency or company type. The registration of one's truck with a military unit or a secret police department is most expensive, while some humble civilian agency, like say a tractor repair workshop, would charge the least. Owners sometimes prefer to pay more, however, because military registration plates might sometimes come in handy with the police. Large transportation companies have developed. I met a person who owned 7 trucks in North Korea. He used these trucks to move salt from salt farms on the East Coast to wholesale markets. Incidentally, salt farms are private as well. This man also augmented his income by moving large sacks of cement that were stolen by workers from a few cement plants continuing to function in post-1994 North Korea. It was a nice income, but he expressed his surprise at the ingenuity of workers who had managed to somehow steal such a large amount of cement. Indeed, one of the major problems for the state has been the growth of criminal and semi-criminal activities. Workers and managers steal from their factories everything they can be sold on the private market. The large-scale looting of archaeological sites from the Koryo 10th to 14th century AD and Chosun 14th to 19th century AD periods became a problem in spite of all efforts to stop it. People responsible for antique smuggling or equipment sale often faced severe penalties. There were even rumors about public executions of such people. Nonetheless, the temptation was far too large. Drug production started to boom around 2005. In earlier days, drugs were produced for clandestine export by government agencies, but private businesses also discovered that great money-making potential of addictive substances, and officials are not too eager to enforce the bans of regulations. They usually get a slice of the profits. Private production usually concentrated on what is known as ice, that is, methamphetamines. Drugs were marketed domestically and also exported to China, where authorities had to step up border control. Ice became surprisingly popular among younger North Koreans, so much so that in 2010, foreign visitors spotted anti-drug posters in Pyongyang colleges. Incidentally, around the same time, the old state-sponsored drug production program was scaled down. Frankly, the entire project obviously did the regime more harm than good, damaging its international reputation while bringing only small payoffs. See Note 8. China features prominently in the unofficial North Korean economy, and in the official economy as well, as we will see below. Nearly all trade links either begin or end in China. Part of this trade is completely unofficial, while other transactions are entirely legal. North Korean merchants mainly import consumption goods from China: garments, shoes, TV sets, and so on. Food also constitutes a significant part of North Korean imports from China. Paradoxically, thanks to this, the years of crisis became a time when the average North Korean began to dress well, or at least better than in earlier times. In Kim Il-sung's days, most people were clad in badly tailored Mao suits or military uniforms. Now, even in the countryside, people you see on the street are dressed colorfully, usually in cheap Chinese imported clothes. To balance this trade account, North Korean merchants export to China that which can be sold there. Apart from minerals, which are still usually handled by the state, they sell seafood, traditional delicacies, and Chinese medicinal herbs, as well as quite exotic items like, for instance, frog oil, a fatty substance extracted from live frogs of certain species that have to be harvested under special conditions. China's ubiquity in the North Korean economy has resulted in the yuanization of the market. Large-scale payments in post-famine North Korea are normally made in foreign currency. Dollars, yen, and euros are not yet unknown, but it is the Chinese yuan that reigns supreme. This situation has led to the emergence of money dealers who trade in foreign currencies and are also sometimes known as loan sharks, providing loans at annual interest rate of 100% or more. A special role in the new economy is played by a particular form of entrepreneurial activity that is neither private nor state. The so-called Foreign Currency Earning Enterprise, FCEE. Such enterprises have existed since Kim Il-sung's era, but greatly increased in number, size, and reach from the late 1990s. Unlike the Soviet Union in North Korea, foreign trade was never under the exclusive control of a single state agency. In accordance with the spirit of self-reliance, large North Korean companies and influential state agencies were allowed to sell anything that could be sold on the international market. They would then use the earned foreign currency to import what couldn't be produced domestically. This practice was greatly expanded in the late 1990s when provinces, ministries, and even the military and police began to set up their own FCEEs. The enterprises did not usually limit themselves to what was produced in-house, but looked for anything that could be sold for a profit. Technically, the FCEEs are owned by the state, but they hire adventurous and entrepreneurial people whose job it is to ensure companies' official clout and connections to earn as much money as possible. It is implicitly understood that these people pocket a large share of their earnings, but as long as they know their limit and provide their supervisors with sufficient kickbacks, profiteering is tolerated. The state withers away. The collapse of the state-run economy had far-reaching political and social consequences. In order to function properly, Kim Il-sung's system required a small army of enforcers and indoctrinators. A considerable workforce was necessary to ensure that every North Korean slept in a home where he or she was registered, did not travel to another city without a proper permit, and did not skip a self-criticism session. In the early 1990s, government discovered that it did not have the resources to reward the zeal of those overseers and indoctrinators. Of course, the regime did what it could to keep police officers and party officials on the payroll and issued them rations even in the middle of the famine. Nonetheless, there were too many such people to be taken care of properly. Thus, in the mid-1990s, a police sergeant, a clerk in the local government office, or a low-level indoctrinator faced a real threat of starvation. Like the average factory worker or school teacher, these small cogs of the bureaucratic machine depended on PDS rations for their food. When the PDS shrank dramatically, they were not considered important enough to remain on a new, much shorter list of distribution targets. A number of my North Korean interlocutors state that in the famine years between 95 and 99, people who had the highest chances of dying were honest officials and clerks. Those who did not take bribes, did not abuse their official position, and took the regime's promises seriously. However, most petty bureaucrats made a rational choice and adjusted their behavior to the new situation. They began to turn a blind eye to illegal activities. In many cases, they had to be bribed to adopt such an attitude, but in other instances, they did so out of sympathy for the common people or because they saw no use in enforcing obviously pointless regulations. One of the best examples is the near complete loss of control over domestic travel. Theoretically, up to the time of writing, North Koreans are expected to apply for a travel permit if they plan an overnight trip outside the borders of their country or city. Starting from around 1996 to 1997, however, these controls became very easy to circumvent. Nowadays, one can bribe a police official and obtain a permit for a relatively small fee, the equivalent of $2 or $3. Alternatively, one can choose a cheaper but more troublesome option, and depart without any travel permit. For that, one must be ready to bribe a policeman at checkpoints and in trains. Only the city of Pyongyang has not been touched by this relaxation. remaining off limits to people from the countryside who do not have proper papers, and such papers are still difficult to get. Sometimes North Koreans could and can get away with what used to be seen as political crimes. For example, possession of a tunable radio set has been a political crime for decades. This is still technically remains the case, but nowadays a bribe of roughly $100 can buy a way out of punishment for someone unlucky enough to have been caught while listening to such a radio. Police would probably even give the offending radio set back to the culprit. Of course, $100 is by no means a trivial amount of money for the average North Korean, since the average monthly salary in 1995 to 2010 fluctuated around the $2 to $3 mark. The actual monthly pay, however, was and is significantly higher, some $15 to $20 a month, since a majority of the North Koreans make most of their income in unofficial economy. Another result of the new situation was the near collapse of control over the Sino-North Korean border. Smugglers have taken advantage of the situation, paying bribes to ensure that border guards always look the other way when necessary. For a large-scale smuggler, a bribe might be as high as a few $100s, but for this amount, he or she would be able to move sacks of valuable merchandise across the border, even being helped by the border guards themselves. Apart from smuggling, the government has relaxed its attitude towards official cross-border trips, which are usually justified by the need to visit relatives in China, but are often of commercial nature. From 2003, for the first time in North Korean history, the authorities began to issue passports to North Koreans who went overseas as private citizens, provided they have the right connections, good family backgrounds, and resources to pay the necessary bribe. Some regulations, often truly absurd, are safely ignored by the very people who are supposed to enforce them. For example, theoretically, North Korean women in cities are not allowed to wear slacks because such attire is considered not befit a woman, and goes against the good habits and beautiful traditions of Korea. Women are also theoretically forbidden to ride bicycles in the city. There are even bans of some subversive types of haircuts. Police have occasionally enforced these nonsensical bans in the past, but from around the mid-1990s became increasingly uninterested. From time to time, ideological authorities will remind people of the moral harm that might be caused by a woman clad shamelessly in slacks, prompting police to levy fines on violators of the ban for a few weeks. These kind of campaigns never last long, however, and seldom bear fruit. Most of the above-mentioned changes are spontaneous in nature, being driven primarily by greed or need, as well as by a loss of ideological fervor on the part of those who upheld the status quo. In some cases, however, the relaxation has been initiated by authorities. For example, around 1996, an illegal border crossing into China, hitherto a serious crime, was reclassified as a relatively minor offense. Around the same time, the Kim Il-sung era family responsibility principle was relaxed. In the past, if a North Korean was arrested for political crimes, his or her entire family would have been shipped to a prison camp. Now such measures are used selectively, only in cases of crimes considered especially dangerous. The general relaxation is quite palpable for somebody who has been dealing with North Korea for decades. Nowadays, North Koreans are less afraid of foreigners and more willing to discuss potentially dangerous matters. It doesn't usually mean that they will deviate from the official line too openly, but the limits of what is permissible have clearly widened in the last 15 to 20 years. North Korean refugees also admit that in Kim Jong-il's North Korea, one often could do or say with impunity something that would get you imprisoned or killed in the Kim Il-sung era. Take the story of Yi Young-gu, a former bodyguard of the dear leader himself. Disappointed in the North Korean system, he fled to China and attempted to defect to South Korea. He was caught by North Korean agents in China and sent back home. In the not-so-distant times of Kim Il-sung, the fate of such a high-profile defector would have been sadly predictable. Torture and death awaited any person who betrayed the personal trust of the great leader. But in the liberal 1990s, Yi was treated with a surprisingly leniency. He was sent to a prison camp and then released. Yes, released, following the intercession of Kim Jong-il himself. He used the opportunity to repeat his escape attempt and reached Seoul. See note number 9. The new rich. North Korea is a poor place, no doubt. Nonetheless, 2012 Pyongyang has become a booming restaurant scene and the traffic on its broad streets. Nonetheless, 2012 Pyongyang has a booming restaurant scene, and the traffic on its broad streets, once notoriously empty, is steadily increasing in volume. Well-fed North Koreans are frequently newly opened sushi bars and beer houses, as well as local hamburger joints. On the streets of the North Korean capital, one can see a lot of visibly undernourished people, but also a number of women clad in designer clothes. These sights can be encountered not only in Pyongyang, but also in a number of other major North Korean cities. The growth of grassroots capitalism predictably brought in a remarkable income inequality. Who are they? The North Korean new rich? How did they make money? And how do they spend this money nowadays? Take, for example, Mr. Kim, who is in his early 40s. Mr. Kim is a private owner of a gold mine. The gold mine is officially registered as a state enterprise. Technically, a foreign trade company owns it, and in turn it was managed by the financial department of the party's central committee. However, this is a legal fiction, pure and simple. Mr. Kim, once a mid-level police official, made some initial capital through bribes and smuggling, while his cousin made a minor fortune through selling counterfeit Western tobacco. They then used their money to grease the palms of bureaucrats, and they took over an old gold mine that had ceased operation in the 1980s. They hired workers, bought equipment, and restarted operations. The gold dust was sold, strictly speaking illegally, to Chinese traders. The cousins agreed with the bureaucrats from the foreign trade company on how much money they should pay for them, roughly between 30 to 40%. They then used the rest to run the business and enjoy life. One step below this, we can see even humbler people like Miss Young, once an engineer at a state factory. In the mid-1990s, she began trading in Chinese second-hand dresses. By 2005, she was running a number of workshops that employed a few dozen women who made copies of Chinese garments using Chinese cloth, zippers, and buttons. Some of the materials were smuggled across the border, while another part were purchased quite legally, largely from a large market in the city of Rason, a special economic zone that can be visited by Chinese merchants almost freely. Miss Young technically remained an employee of a non-functioning state factory, which she was absent from for months on end. She had to pay for the privilege of missing work and indoctrination sessions, deducting some $40 as her monthly donation. This is an impressive sum when compared to her official salary of merely $2. The North Korean new rich might occasionally feel insecure. They might be afraid of the state because pretty much everything they do is in breach of some article of North Korean criminal code. It is a serious breach indeed. Technically, any of the above described persons can be sent to face an execution squad the moment the authorities change their mind. They provide officials with generous kickbacks, and in recent years, massive crackdowns have been infrequent. Yet, the fear lingers nonetheless. It is, however, difficult to say that they try to keep a low profile. On the contrary, nowadays one can see a lot of conspicuous consumption in North Korea. It is no surprise that the new rich enjoy consumption. Some kinds of consumption activities are impossible. For example, overseas trips are out of the question, and domestic tourism seems to be unfashionable. North Koreans, rich or poor, usually travel out of necessity, not for pleasure. However, there are many outlets that cater to the needs of masters of money, Tongju, as North Korean entrepreneurs are known. The new rich frequent restaurants, where a good meal would cost roughly as much as the average North Korean family makes in a couple of weeks. They buy and renovate houses. Technically, the sale of real estate is illegal in North Korea, but in the last 2 decades, North Koreans have developed many techniques that allow circumvention of these restrictions. The new rich buy all kinds of household appliances, flat-screen TVs, computers, large fridges, and motorbikes. Even private cars, an ultimate status symbol, a North Korean equivalent of a private jet, have begun to appear. And since around 2009, one can see traffic jams on the streets of Pyongyang, once famously empty. In good old Confucian spirit, the new rich invest in the education of their children. A good teacher of a popular subject, like say English or Chinese, might earn a decent income nowadays. Less practical subjects are also in demand, although piano and dance lessons are deemed suitable for girls only. Taking the exit option. Not an exodus yet, but... From the mid-1990s, North Koreans began to move to China in large numbers. It was not that difficult because most of the length of both the Yalu and the Tumen is shallow, narrow, and frozen in winter. This being the case between 1998 and 1999, when the famine was at its height, it was estimated that anywhere from 150,000 to 195,000 North Koreans were hiding in China. See Note 10. After 2005, the numbers shrank dramatically, but it's estimated that in any given moment there are still between 20,000 and 40,000 North Korean refugees hiding in China. See Note 11. Most of these people hiding in villages and towns along the border where ethnic Koreans constitute a majority of the population. Refugees do all kinds of odd jobs that were avoided by the locals. They wait tables at cheap eateries, work at construction sites, and labor in the timber industry. Since women constitute a majority of refugees, many of them cohabitate with Chinese men, sometimes being abducted, but more frequently through personal choice. Many of these unions result in disaster, while others work out just fine. Indeed, it might benefit both sides. A Chinese-Korean man of advanced age and moderate income gets a wife, while a North Korean woman gets a sense of security and a standard of living unthinkable back home. The local Chinese authorities usually turn a blind eye to such unions, especially if the couple has children. Nonetheless, a North Korean common-law wife, such unions cannot be registered officially, is still not free from the worst fear of any North Korean refugee in China: arrest and deportation. Until the mid-1990s, every North Korean who had crossed over into China and was unfortunate enough to be extradited back would face a few years of imprisonment and, upon release, lifelong discrimination. This is not the case anymore because border crossing itself is seen as a minor offense. When people are extradited from China, they are usually investigated for a week or two. This investigation usually involves some beating. Investigators want to make certain that the suspects had no contacts with South Koreans and non-Chinese foreigners during their stay in China, and that they were not involved with any Christian missionary group. If no such suspicious connections are discovered, the extradited refugee spends a few months in a milder type of labor camp and is then released. Upon release, many of them flee again. After all, they often have families and jobs back in China. Some refugees decide to move further, to South Korea, though this is not as simple as it sounds. Long gone are the times when every North Korean who decided to defect was lucky enough to get overseas could just walk into the nearest South Korean consulate or embassy and inform the cheerful staff that he or she had just chosen freedom, as the Cold War cliché went. Nowadays, while a 2-star general of North Korean Air Force or a district party secretary can still count on an enthusiastic welcome, the same does not hold for a middle-aged housewife from a rural area, and such a housewife is the typical defector of the past decade. As a rule, there are exceptions, South Korean missionaries in China prefer not to deal with the average refugee. This is explained in terms of a fear of diplomatic complications with China, but the South Korean government also is not all that enthusiastic about the increasing number of refugees in the South. At the same time, the fiction of One Korea, still maintained by both Seoul and Pyongyang, means that every single North Korean is automatically eligible for South Korean citizenship and consular protection. For a majority of the refugees, the only way to reach South Korea is to get to a third country, usually Thailand or Mongolia, where South Korean diplomatic missions, sometimes reluctantly, process refugees and issue them travel documents and airline tickets to Seoul. This, however, means that a refugee has to traverse all of China first, and then illegally cross the Chinese border into Mongolia or Laos. Such a trip is almost impossible for the average refugee who speaks poor, if any, Chinese, and has little money and no local knowledge. The only way, therefore, is to make a deal with a professional escape specialist known as a broker. Such a broker assembles a group of 5 to 15 aspiring refugees, arranges transportation and safe accommodation, and then escorts them to China's southern border, if the final destination is Bangkok, or to Mongolia. There, he or she arranges a border crossing and then accompanies the refugees on their perilous trip across the Gobi Desert or the jungles of Laos. Brokers usually do not work for the actualization of some lofty ideal. Some of them might have ideological convictions, but in the main, defection has long become a commercial operation, pure and simple. For a no-thrills defection, one must pay between $2,000 and $3,000, while a VIP version of the service would cost between $10,000 and $15,000. This expensive option would involve a fake South Korean or Chinese passport, North Korean border guards escorting the defector across the border, and a comfortable air trip from a major Chinese airport straight to South Korea. See Note 12. The cost of even the cheapest defection is exorbitant for the average North Korean refugee in China, whose wages are between $50 and $100 a month. Usually the sum is provided by relatives in South Korea or elsewhere overseas, most frequently by a family member who has managed to defect to the South first, and probably now awaits tables in Seoul restaurants. As we will see, most defectors are not exactly successful in South Korea. As of early 2012, there were some 23,000 North Korean refugees living in South Korea. It doesn't sound like a large figure, especially if we consider that between 1961 and 1989, during the years of the Berlin Wall, an average of 23,000 East Germans crossed into West Germany every single year. However, it sounds far more impressive if we remember that as recently as the year 2000, where merely 1,100 refugees were residing in the South. This is by no means an exodus, but for the first time since the end of the Korean War, there emerged a significant group of North Koreans who managed to get away from the loving care of the fatherly leader. These people are very different from the Communist bloc refugees who arrived in the West during the Cold War. The Cold War refugees from the Eastern Bloc tended to be well educated and were usually motivated by political convictions, at least partially. Conversely, most North Korean refugees are women from impoverished areas along the border who were looking for a better income and security rather than for the realization of some lofty political ideals. Elite refugees exist, but they are well below 10% of the total. With a touch of somewhat frivolous generalization, a typical refugee of the Soviet Union in the 1970s might be described as young, brilliant, Jewish chess player. In contrast, the average refugee from North Korea is a rural housewife in her 50s. It is important to mention, however, that refugees remain in touch with their families back home. It helps that most refugees come from borderland areas whose population can cross the border more easily. People frequently call their families using Chinese cell phones, which work perfectly well on the North Korean side of the border. From around 2003, a number of relay stations were built just on the border, and this greatly increased the mobile phone coverage. Signals can be received miles away. This being the case, Chinese cell phones have become common among the affluent North Koreans in the borderland, most of whom earn an income through legal and not-so-legal trade with China. Monetary remittances from South to North Korea constitute a blatant violation of both South Korean and North Korean laws, but nonetheless seem to be fairly frequent. A majority of refugees in the South use brokers to send money back to their impoverished native villages and towns. Brokers charge 25 to 30% per transaction, but the system is remarkably reliable and fast. The total annual amount of such transfers has recently been estimated at some $10 million, by no means an insignificant sum of money for the tiny North Korean economy. See Note 13. Arrival in Paradise, aka Capitalist Hell. The fate of refugees in South Korea does not bode too well for the post-unification population of North Korea, assuming that unification will happen one day. Most of them will find themselves in a low-income bracket, often the object of discrimination by their newly found brethren. North Korean refugees are eligible for aid that is quite generous by the standards of South Korea, a country where the social welfare system remains underdeveloped as compared with Europe and the United States. For the first few years, refugees are paid a small stipend, not enough to live on, but still of help. They are also provided with subsidized rental and housing and scholarships for vocational training. Those who are young enough can apply for university admission. They do not compete with South Korean high school pupils. Rather, they sit on their own easier exams. That said, the statistics are discouraging. In December 2010, research confirmed that the average income of a North Korean refugee in the South is merely 1.27 million won, $1,170. That is roughly 50% of the average South Korean salary. Unemployment is high, depending on which of a few different studies you believe and how you define, quote, unemployment, unquote. It is estimated that between 10 and 40%. Even the most optimistic estimates are depressing at best if one takes into account that South Korea has one of the lowest unemployment rates among countries in the developed world. Only 439 defectors, merely 4% of all employed defectors, were working in skilled jobs, while 77% were employed in unskilled jobs. See Note 14. Furthermore, North Koreans discover that mainstream South Korean society looks upon them with a measure of suspicion. A sad story was recently told to me by a North Korean acquaintance. In 2011, a South Korean television company wanted to make a TV show about North-South couples, i.e. North Korean refugee women married to South Korean men. Participants were promised significant monetary rewards, and thus many female refugees initially agreed to the proposal. A few days later, however, most of the candidates called back to the program's producers to say they would not participate in the program regardless of how much money was offered. It was their husbands who decisively opposed the idea. They did not want their neighbors, co-workers, and social contacts to know that they had married a North Korean woman. My North Korean female interlocutor said, "You know, here in the South it is sort of assumed that only down and outs, people who can't get a proper South Korean woman, marry mail-order brides from Southeast Asia or North Korean refugees." Surprisingly, even refugees with elite educations can face big challenges in the South. Unless their job directly relates to dealing with the North and the supply of such jobs is limited, they have great trouble finding any prestigious job. This is partially a result of suspicions that most employers have about their skills, and partially because of their inability to use their extended personal networks that are so central to the success in South Korean society. These networks usually unite people from the same region, members of the same clan, or graduates of the same university. North Korean refugees usually do not belong to any of these groups. Lastly, but not least, the graduation rate for refugee university students is low. A majority of those who enter a university drop out. Even though the dropout rate in South Korean universities tends to be very low, North Korean students often discover that they lack what is considered to be basic knowledge and social skills, advantages their South Korean peers possess. Added to that, many of them have to work to make a living, unlike their South Korean classmates who usually work merely for pocket money. To make up for the gaps in their background knowledge, they have to study harder than their South Korean peers, but economic pressures make this difficult. Despite these issues, it would be wrong to assume that North Koreans feel regret about their move to the South. There have been indeed a few cases of refugees fleeing the South in order to head back north, but for every such case there are hundreds of instances where individuals and entire families work hard to pay a broker in order to bring their relations to the South. Nonetheless, the problems are real, and they are likely to increase in magnitude in the case of unification. After all, refugees, as a self-selecting group, have an above-average ability to adjust to the differences between the North and South. It follows that a group of people who have consciously chosen a different life will face fewer problems adjusting to massive change than a group of people who have had a different life forced upon them. Therefore, when and if unification comes, the above-mentioned problems are merely a sample of the social and economic issues that will face the South Korean state and the North Korean people above all. A normal day. It is not difficult to find the most representative North Korean newspaper. Everyone knows that this role has been reserved for the Rodong Shinmun, for the ruling Korean Workers' Party mouthpiece. This is not just a humble newspaper, but the voice of the party and the state itself. One day last year, while dropping by the National Library, I decided to have a look at the latest issue of this venerable newspaper. The latest available issue happened to be published on July 11, 2011, and the choice was completely random. The entire front page was taken up by one large, unsigned article that informed the reader of the greatest event of late. The dear leader, Marshal Kim Jong-il, inspected the largest department store in the city of Pyongyang and provided its personnel with a wealth of managerial guidance on the best way to run its retail outlet. The article was accompanied by two pictures. One depicts the marshal taking an escalator with some of his entourage, and another shows the leader standing with the top management of the department store. The upper part of the second page was occupied by a report of another event. Marshal Kim had inspected the Pyongyang Zoo and taught its personnel a thing or two about animal rearing and zoo management. The second page also included official telegrams sent to and received from China on a diplomatic event, the 50th anniversary of the Treaty of Friendship and Alliance between China and North Korea. The page also had a small report about an event to commemorate the 117th birthday of a humble rural school teacher, Christian missionary and nationalist named Kim Hyung-ji. He happens to be the grandfather of Marshal Kim Jong-il and the father of Kim Il-sung. The third page contained a half-dozen reports about labor enthusiasm and production achievements. Somewhat uncharacteristically, these reports almost exclusively focus on the light industry, obviously resulting from the recent emphasis on the production of consumption goods. An article in the bottom right corner attracts some attention. It tells us of how housewives of a particular county created a model reconstruction brigade to work on irrigation projects in the area. A small picture depicts the construction site. Women are neatly dressed, but there is not a machine to be seen, so they use only shovels and their bare hands to line the walls with the irrigation canals with block-like rocks. The fourth page was filled with reports of foreign visitors who had come to North Korea to express their admiration for the country's great achievements. Most delegations are Chinese, but it is reported that a group of Russian police officials have also come to join the chorus and have expressed their admiration of the great successes of North Korea, achieved under the wise leadership of Comrade Kim Jong-il. The fifth page dealt with South Korea and foreign policy. The largest article was titled "The Hatred of Treacherous Regime" and told North Koreans how much their South Korean compatriots hate the current South Korean administration of President Lee. There are reports of strikes, police abuse, and unfolding scandal in South involving U.S. military use of defoliants at a military base. A small photo depicted a students' rally in Seoul, whose participants were demanding a 50% cut in tuition fees. The accompanying article did not even hint at the fact that such a cut was actually suggested by the treacherous regime of Lee Myung-bak. Instead, it deliberately created the impression that South Korean students have begun this revolutionary fight spontaneously, because they could not bear the prohibitively large burden of tuition fees. The final page again dealt with the foreign policy. It began with a large and boring, even by Rodo and Shinmun's notorious standards, article about the eternal friendship between China and North Korea. It also included reports from other parts of the world that talk about how much the people of the world admire Generalissimo Kim Il-sung, the founder of the North Korean dynasty. According to the newspaper, commemorative events to honor the memory of the late Generalissimo Kim had been held in Romania, Nigeria, Congo, and Thailand. The sixth page also contained an article commemorating UN World Population Day. The article concentrated on gender inequality in the capitalist world and contained some statistics about the sorry fate of Western European women, clearly the world's greatest victims of gender discrimination. Another article on the sixth page dealt with the complex situation of the world food market. Obviously, it was published in order to tell the readers that North Korea is not unique in having grave food shortages. Nonetheless, the article stood out because it was almost free from demagogy, and indeed contained an interesting analysis of current international trends, perhaps the only piece in the entire newspaper that deserves to be called an article. Such is the daily fare of news and views provided to North Koreans by their media, day by day, for decades, without much change. Changing worldviews. Approximately 500,000 North Koreans have visited China over the last 15-odd years, and most of them have eventually returned home, voluntarily or otherwise. They have to be cautious, but nonetheless manage to tell stories about China's prosperity, descriptions that are indeed shocking to any first-time North Korean visitor. Once while in northeast China, I had a conversation with a member of an NGO who occasionally brings junior North Korean officials to a sleepy, dirty Chinese town in Manchuria. I asked him about the typical reaction of these North Koreans, to which he responded, "They cannot sleep for the first couple of nights. They are so shocked and overwhelmed by the prosperity of the place, by the brilliant lights of the nightlife of the town." To the present writer, this particular Chinese town during the night looked more like an abandoned steel mill. Chinese prosperity might be overwhelming at first, but soon North Korean refugees discovered that these Chinese, whom they regard as filthy rich, actually consider it their own country poor in comparison to South Korea. Indeed, it's not difficult to learn a lot about South Korea when in northeast China. South Korean satellite TV is widely watched by ethnic Korean families, and South Korean soap operas with Chinese subtitles are a staple of local TV networks. At any given moment, roughly 1 out of 7 ethnic Koreans in the Yanbian areas of At any given moment, roughly 1 out of 7 ethnic Koreans of the Yanbian area resides in South Korea, usually being employed on some unskilled, badly paid job. It does not take long for a North Korean refugee to learn that more or less everything that he or she used to read in the official media about the South is a blatant and grotesque lie. This discovery does not necessarily make him or her dream about going to Seoul. After all, such a step requires considerable resources and is inherently risky and might be simply not to everybody's liking. Nonetheless, stories of the fairy tale land south of the DMZ are shared with trusted friends and family members back home. From around 2000, VCRs and soon afterward DVD players began to spread in North Korea in large numbers. These machines are cheap and perfectly legal. It was assumed that North Koreans would use them to watch officially approved and ideologically wholesome fare, like, say, biopics of the dear leader and his extended family. However, North Koreans usually prefer to watch something different and rather ideologically suspicious, smuggled foreign movies and TV dramas, often those produced in South Korea. As always is the case with North Korea, statistics are highly unreliable. According to Chinese customs, 350,000 DVD players were brought to North Korea in 2006 alone, a large number for a country with a population of some 24 million. See Note 15. It seems that in border areas and major cities, 1 out of every 3 or 4 families has a DVD player nowadays. A study by Intermedia Research Group concluded that in 2009 the penetration rate was 21% and 5% for VCD and DVD players, respectively. See Note 16. From my own research, it seems that the borderland areas of the country, some 70 to 80% of all households were in possession of DVD players by early 2012. We can be sure that more or less all of these families have watched South Korean programs. These shows, unlike the DVD players themselves, are illegal, but small entrepreneurs in China make good money by recording them and then smuggling the copies across the border. Even computers are becoming increasingly common among the more affluent part of the population. Estimates vary, but one can surmise that the number of privately owned computers, or computers that can be accessed with relative ease, now definitely exceeds 100,000, and is likely to reach a few 100,000. A Western diplomat recently related to the present author that USB memory sticks have become a popular fashion accessory among the privileged Pyongyang youth. The message is unmistakable. By sporting a USB, an individual demonstrates that he or she has access to a computer, one of the most important status symbols in present-day Pyongyang. Nowadays, possession of a computer in North Korea is somewhat akin to the ownership of a sports car in more affluent societies. See Note 17. North Korean computers are not connected to the internet, and only some of them have a dial-up connection with the national intranet known as the Kwangmyong network. However, even without an internet connection, a computer remains a powerful information dissemination device, largely thanks to USB and CDR drives. The authorities are aware of these threats, and therefore all computers are registered and their hard drives subject to random checks by the authorities. Recently, the security bureaucracy created a special division, the so-called Bureau 27, to monitor and control privately owned computers. Frankly, however, one should be skeptical about the effectiveness of such checks. A teenage computer enthusiast will always outsmart an aging policeman, especially if the latter does not see a good reason to be excessively vigilant. As to South Korean movies and TV dramas, North Koreans do not necessarily always believe everything they see. Their own movies have always presented a grossly embellished picture of life in North Korea, and they expect this to be the case everywhere in the world. For example, as my own talks with North Korean refugees confirm, few of them believed that the average South Korean family had a car when they saw their first South Korean TV dramas. In actual fact, more or less every South Korean family does own a car, and as of 2010, the country of a population with 50 million has 13.6 million passenger cars. The interior of a normal South Korean apartment, frequently shown in movies, did not look plausible to them either. They believed it to be a set, and that such a lifestyle, with that unbelievably large fridge in the kitchen, would be available only to a select few. Nonetheless, they also know some things are difficult or impossible to fake, like, say, the Seoul cityscape, with all its high-rise buildings and giant bridges, and they use these trustworthy images as visual clues, surmising that South Korea must be very rich indeed. North Korean people are now increasingly aware that South Korea's prosperity. As one defector, a woman in her late 50s, remarked to the present author, well, perhaps children in primary school still believe that South Koreans are poor, but everybody else knows that the South is rich. But there are two important caveats. First, it is not quite clear how far this new conscientiousness has spread outside the borderlands of a few major cities. Second, while the average North Korean has begun to suspect that the South is ahead of the North economically, he or she seldom comprehends how huge this gap really is. After all, for the North Korean farmer or skilled worker, being wealthy means feasting on a rich gruel every day. Since around 2000, even North Korea propaganda began to take into account this slow change of mind. After all, Pyongyang's agit-prop shock brigades are not as inflexible as they appear to many foreign observers. Those who are seriously interested in the changes of North Korea's propaganda should read the informative works of Brian Myers and Tatiana Gabrosenko. In the post-2000 propaganda, the alleged poverty of South Korea has ceased to be a topic worthy of mention. It is even grudgingly admitted that South Korea might be relatively affluent. Of course, this affluence was described as a bubble economy being propped up by the scheming U.S. imperialists for self-interest, and hence inherently unstable. However, with all its wealth, South Korea is represented as a basically very unhappy place. The reason for this unhappiness is that South Koreans' national identity, their precious Koreanness, has been spoilt and compromised by the domination of American imperialists who propagate their degrading and corrosive culture. In the post-2000 propaganda narrative, South Koreans are suffering not from hunger, but from national humiliation, as well as cultural and environmental degradation. South Koreans allegedly dream of liberation and envy happy Northerners, who might experience some temporary economic difficulties, but nonetheless have managed to keep their pure national essence intact, and have not sold out to those big-nosed servants of Mammon. The North Korean stereotype of Americans is remarkably similar to the anti-Semitic stereotypes. Another recurrent topic of this new propaganda is the inequalities and assorted social ills that permeate South Korean society. As a matter of fact, by international standards, South Korea is a society of remarkable income equality, the Scandinavia of East Asia, as sociologist Aidan Foster Carter once remarked. But the South Korean left strongly believes otherwise. North Korean newspapers therefore happily reprint articles from the South Korean leftist media, painting a grim picture of a country where the pampered few suck the blood of a destitute majority. Alleged environmental pollution has become another large topic nowadays. Interestingly, in the past, North Korea loved to present itself as a country of enormous steel mills and smoky factories. But nowadays, after the industrial collapse of the 1990s, the propagandists love to wax rhapsodic about the allegedly pristine environment of the country. and contrast it with the industrial pollution and environmental degradation of the South. To what extent does this propaganda work? This, of course, remains to be seen. Most likely, a significant number of North Koreans buy this new propaganda line about relatively affluent but unhappy and debased South Korea. But the yellow winds of capitalism and an understanding of South Korean prosperity is spreading as well. This growing awareness of the outside world is merely one of many changes that have occurred in the era of capitalism from below. North Koreans' attitude towards domestic issues is changing as well. People below the age of 30 simply have no experience of life under the old regime of comprehensive rationing, and are therefore not inclined to see the state as a natural provider of all life's necessities. Many above the age of 30 have learned that they can do without the state, and some of them came to enjoy this new situation. Once again, these trends should not be exaggerated. From regular interaction with North Koreans, I have come to suspect that the average North Korean would much prefer a regimented life under Kim Il-sung to the uncertainties of the subsequent era. After all, in Kim Il-sung's era, everybody who was not unlucky to find themselves in a prison camp was certain that his or her subsistence level rations would be forthcoming regularly. Sometimes people were malnourished, but they never starved. Soon after Kim Il-sung's death in 1994, this old stability had gone. It is likely that the less successful majority would prefer to go back to the comfort of regularly delivered rations, even if this means more boring indoctrination sessions and greater risks of being sent to prison for a misinterpreted joke. At any rate, North Koreans do not have much choice. They have to adjust. Therefore, they have had to adjust, thereby modifying their career aspirations as well. For example, in spite of a significant increase in the intensity of militaristic propaganda after 1994, many North Koreans try to skip obligatory military service. In the past, the 7 to 10 years spent in the military were seen as attractive because soldiers could easily join the Korean Workers' Party, thus acquiring the most essential prerequisite for social advancement. But party membership is not as highly prized as it used to be. After all, for an upwardly mobile and adventurous individual, the marketplace provides a faster way to earthly success. People have begun to ignore the institutions of state that were once created to keep them under constant surveillance. The notorious weekly mutual criticism sessions, as well as indoctrination meetings of various kinds, still continue, but they have become somewhat less frequent and have lost much of their earlier intensity. One can even skip boring official functions in order to not miss a profitable day at the market, even though this might require a bit of bribery. Although completely unthinkable in Kim Il-sung's North Korea, even riots began to occur occasionally. In March 2005, for example, Pyongyang experienced what was probably the first riot in the city in 60 years. The riot itself began at Kim Il-sung Stadium during a World Cup qualifying match between North Koreans and the Iranian team. In the middle of the game, an argument erupted between a North Korean player and a Syrian referee. The North Korean player shoved the referee, was sent off, and then violence erupted. Fans began to throw bottles, stones, chairs, and everything they could find at the Iranian players and referees. It took a few minutes before order was restored, while the stadium loudspeakers demanded that fans stay calm. The North Korean team eventually lost 2-0, and violence resumed, continuing for almost 2 hours after the match. There were clashes between police and fans, and for a while Iranian players could not leave the stadium because of the unruly and outraged crowds inside. All of these events unfolded in front of foreign media, who did not miss an opportunity to take rare shots of North Koreans fighting with police. This was a patriotic riot, no doubt, driven by lofty and officially sanctioned emotions, but it nonetheless demonstrated that the foundations of social control were eroding. Around the same time, market riots in the countryside, admittedly less patriotic in their intentions, began to occur as well. The outbreak of public discontent usually happens at the markets when vendors believe that their right to make money is being unfairly infringed by some decision of the authorities. For example, between 2006 and 2007, when the government unsuccessfully tried to restart the PDS, some markets were closed, and a considerable part of the local population was deprived of the major source of their livelihoods. This resulted in numerous protests, usually by middle-aged women. Reportedly, their cry was, "Give us rations or let us trade." Not exactly a pro-democracy demonstration, but still a challenge to the established authority. The North Korean authorities have been remarkably and unusually lenient when dealing with these market riots. Taking into consideration the secretiveness of the North Korean legal system, one cannot rule out that some of the ringleaders in such incidents might have been secretly punished. But many of those who participated in the disturbances received only light punishments, or escaped punishment completely. These signs of social relaxation should not be overestimated. The North Korean state still remains one of the most repressive regimes in the world. In spite of some cracks, its surveillance system is second to none in efficiency and brutality. Nonetheless, changes are palpable. North Korea is drifting away from Kim Il-sung's nationalist Stalinism. The drift is slow and might take years or even decades before it results in dramatic consequences. But it seems clear the society Kim Il-sung built is slowly but inexorably crumbling and being replaced. As this happens, contradictions between the existing old political order and the emerging social order will lead to more rapid change, and, just as importantly, to the demand for more rapid change. Where these demands will end, we cannot yet be sure.